Hello and welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and fifth elections are officially upon us. With the so-called change government dissolved, some 6.8 million eligible Israeli voters are gathering the strength to cast their ballot for the fifth time in 43 months. And 39 parties are taking stage in this political theater, 11 major factions assumed to make it in, and 28 smaller parties that have slimmed to little hopes of passing the 3.5% electoral threshold required to enter the Knesset. But here to discuss the end of the campaigns and offer insights and predictions, journalist and JNS Jerusalem Bureau Chief Alex Traiman. Alex, thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it. I'll begin right with the first question. Are Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich the kingmakers this election?
I think that the kingmaker is ultimately the 61 seat threshold, that former Prime Minister Netanyahu would need in order to form a majority coalition. If he does, then you can assume that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir will be part of that. There is an possibility that Netanyahu could turn to Benny Gantz or other left-wing partners and try to form a centrist government, as he's done in opportunities at the past. But certainly Netanyahu cannot be prime minister unless the entire bloc, which includes both Likud and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, reaches 61-seat threshold minimum.
Well, so jumping to Gantz for a moment then, do you think that that's actually a possibility, though, that Gantz and Saar would join a Bibi-led government, or would Gantz perhaps want to be prime minister, and would Netanyahu even allow such a thing, especially after their last, unity government that failed?
Well, you're correct, and coalition negotiations are tricky business. I know for certain that Gantz and Saar would never give the votes that Netanyahu would need in order to form a 61-seat majority. However, if 61 members of the upcoming Knesset recommend Netanyahu to be the prime minister, meaning that Netanyahu could form a majority right-wing coalition government, then you might see someone like Gantz and Saar, who are in the same party, come forward and say, hey, we will sit with Netanyahu in this situation, provided that you don't sit with Itamar Ben-Gvir, and then they can say to their voters, we never would have empowered Netanyahu to be the prime minister, but we are saving the country from forming a narrow right-wing government, instead giving Netanyahu the opportunity to form a more centrist government.
Wait, so are you suggesting, though, that some of the members of the Knesset, of the next Knesset, under parties like Gideon Saar's and Gantz's, would go against their party leadership and vote for Netanyahu for the sake of reaching 61?
No, I think it would be Benny Gantz himself. Okay. And I don't think that, let's be clear about it. Benny Gantz will not recommend Netanyahu to be the prime minister to the president after the votes are counted. But if Netanyahu and his natural right-wing allies are able to formulate numbers of 61 or higher, which is what they need in order to form a government, then you might see someone like Gantz step forward and say, okay, I'm going to drop all my demands. I want to come to this government. My only demand is that you don't sit with Itamar Ben-Gvir. And then Gantz can come back to his constituents on the left side of the Israeli political spectrum and say that he saved the country from having a narrow right-wing government, and instead he's the one that facilitated a more centrist government.
So on the other hand, could Gantz and Saar end up, in a sense, becoming the leadership themselves, overtaking Lapid? Could they be a unifying party, similar to how Bennett and his Jewish Home and his Yamina party were?
Yeah, that remains to be seen. It looks like the most likely option of any candidate to form a government would be Netanyahu. He may get 61, he may not. If he doesn't, it will be very difficult for Yair Lapid, who's sitting in the second position, to form a government, unless he can form it together with all the Arab parties, for the first time in the last elections, Ram, one of the Arab parties actually affiliated with Muslim Brotherhood, decided to enter the government. The Joint List, a second Arab party, is actually more extreme than Ram, and they've pledged they've never sat in any government, and it would be a precedent for them to come in. So assuming that they wouldn't come in, then Yair Lapid would also find himself being short of the 61-seat majority. And then the horse trading will begin among all the various parties to see who would become prime minister and who might be able to cobble together a coalition. Benny Gantz has been campaigning on the fact that he might be able to be a unifying force among some of the disparate parties that wouldn't otherwise sit together, and may hope to emerge in the same way you mentioned Naftali Bennett did in the last elections, as maybe the first in some kind of a rotation arrangement as the prime minister.
So how about Ayelet Shaked, Naftali Bennett's right-hand woman? Where does she fit into all of this? She carries some right-wing votes, but as of now, it's looking like she may not even pass the electoral threshold. Is this the end of the line for her?
Well, people will recall during these various election cycles, in the second election cycle, Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked ran together. In fact, at that time, Shaked was the leader of the party with Bennett as the number two. And they wound up being approximately 10,000 votes shy of the Knesset threshold to enter into government to begin with. So they would have been completely out of government. However, the second election ended in a stalemate, and we wound up going to a third rapid-fire election, at which point they did manage to cross the threshold after that. So they got a reprieve, and they got back in. Now, Naftali Bennett found himself really without a voter base because he ran to the right. He very famously campaigned saying that he would never sit with Lapid, saying that Lapid was left and he was right. He actually signed a piece of paper and held it up to the cameras on the night before the election, saying that he would not sit in a rotation arrangement or any other arrangement with Yair Lapid. And then he did exactly that. So his right-wing voter base is very, very upset with him. And when his government collapsed after barely a year, he announced that he was going to be retiring from politics, and he left his party to Ayelet Shaked. Right. Now, Shaked has been running, apologizing for sitting with Lapid and all of the left-wing parties, and saying that Netanyahu needs her in order to have a government. Her campaign ads on Tel Aviv say, "Bli Bet Ein Bibi." Bet is the symbol that you vote with for Shaked's party, and Bibi, the name, has two bets in it. So it was a cute gesture saying that Netanyahu won't be able to form a government without Shaked. None of the polls today show that Shaked is even close to crossing the Knesset threshold, which means that if the polls hold, that maybe 100,000 votes that would otherwise be right-wing votes will be discounted. Any party that does not make it across the 3.25 Knesset threshold, every single one of those votes for a party that doesn't make it gets completely discounted, and then the rest of the votes get distributed. And I would have to imagine that if Shaked costs the right wing the chance to form a government by not crossing the threshold, that this may very well be the end of the line for her.
Wow. All right. Now, we mentioned earlier the Arab vote and some of the Arab parties, but Netanyahu and Lapid are both, again, vying hard for the Arab vote, where voter turnout, however, is expected to be at an all-time low, and it's been dropping precipitously, really, from one election to the next. Why would the Arab Israelis, however, vote Likud when they're partnered with Itamar Ben-Gvir and, the religious far right?
Because Netanyahu and the far right are actually for greater security in these areas. Itamar Ben-Gvir has been wants to crack down on crime. Arab on Arab crime has surged to incredible levels, and there's a potential belief, or at least an argument that could be made, that having greater security secures the citizens no matter what their race.
All right, now we're joined now by attorney Ziv Maor, legal counsel to the Hallel-Likud Forum and Im Tirtzu. Ziv, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, now, similar question. I just asked Alex about the Arab vote and why they would really vote for the Likud. And he mentioned about security, how the Likud and the right-wing parties have been very staunch about raising the level of security and securing some of these areas in the Arab sector. But the same could arguably be said about Lapid and Bennett's government, couldn't it?
Well, it depends, because to some extent, I believe that the Arab Street does not have any faith in the capability of Lapid and Gantz to serve them in any way, because they did not do so. During the long Netanyahu period, the 12 years, he managed to not only promise budget to development in Arab areas, those funds were also managed in a way that secured that they will not go to corrupt local government, but will be managed by the central government in a method that eventually turned out to be fruitful for the people themselves. This is what Netanyahu did. And the approach that Gantz and Bennett and Lapid took on this issue was simply delivering the money not only to the local corrupt government, but also to the political national leadership of the Arabs, which turned out to be even more corrupt. What they did with the money, they invested it in corporations that increased the wealth of the people involved in them, and in some portion used it as benevolence to Palestinian causes in Gaza and Judea and Samaria. Eventually, the Arab Street received, I wouldn't say not a single penny, but very low amount of funds out of a way bigger promise, 10 times as big as Netanyahu promised. But the Netanyahu money eventually trickled down to the streets, and Lapid did not. So if they will decide eventually to ditch the nationalistic approach and not to vote to their anti-Semitic, pro-Palestinian leadership that they're currently with, and vote to a Zionist party, not because it is Zionist, but because it promises better services for them as civilians, then they would be better off voting to the right and to the left, because the left have proven not to be effective on this issue.
All right, well, in the same vein, there have been several analysts who in recent weeks have suggested that these elections are going to come down to the ultra-Orthodox vote and the Arab-Israeli vote. Lapid just yesterday spoke with Arab media saying that he'll do away with the nation-state law, for example. And again, how crucial are these two votes, and is there any way for them to really sway from where they are? Because something like 70–80% of the electorate is pretty solid on where they're going to vote, according to most polls.
There is a strong peculiarity in those elections, which make a reality in which anybody who votes for Lapid, or for that matter for Gantz and for a Labour Party or Meretz, actually votes for Netanyahu to become prime minister. If you vote for Lapid, you will vote for Netanyahu. How come? Because the prospect is that at least one Arab party, probably two, will not go through the threshold. And the threshold is moved according to how many votes, eventually legal votes, will be counted. The more there are, the higher the threshold. Now, if you vote to a Zionist party, be it Gantz, be it Lapid, or any of the other, you bring the threshold a little bit up, and you make the threshold, the barrier higher for the Arab population to go over. If you vote for a Zionist party, you increase the chances that Netanyahu will receive more than 61 seats in the Knesset. This is how it works, because it eliminates the chances for all of the Arab parties to go through the threshold. This is how crucial these elections are, and this is a sort of a conundrum that Lapid is in.
Alex, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that the two issues here that come up are, number one, the threshold. And you're right that there are several parties, the two Arab parties, several of the left-wing parties and smaller left-wing parties, including Meretz and Labour, hovering around the threshold. We mentioned before that Ayelet Shaked's party is hovering below the threshold. Any one of these parties that falls below the threshold, that basically redistributes at least half of those votes to the other side of the spectrum. And so the two issues are, again, if one party does make it or doesn't make it, that can swing the election by itself. Also, voter turnout can affect the elections because, for example, you mentioned the Haredi parties. The Haredi parties typically poll at around 15 to 16 seats, but they don't have high voter turnout. So it's not that those votes would would flip to a different party. But if there's higher voter turnout and the Haredi parties could get 17 or 18 seats, that's more seats for the right-wing bloc, because those are votes that otherwise wouldn't have been included because the voter turnout was usually lower. And the same thing with Likud. During the second election cycle, the Likud actually surged to 36 seats because they discovered close to 300,000 new votes in periphery areas that have a normal tendency to vote for Likud, but had low voter turnout. And that's where they're focusing a lot of their campaign efforts this time. If they can basically invent votes that otherwise would go to them by just dragging people out to the polls, they may be able to swing the election in that way.
Wow.
Now, the Haredi turnout is also something that is worth to discuss.
Right.
From what I hear, this year it's going to be particularly low because of two reasons. First of all, lack of prominent rabbinical leadership since the death of Rabbi Kanievsky, who was the leader or the halachic leader of most of the Ashkenazi Haredi portion. There is no socially accepted alternative to him, and thus the motivations to vote goes down. And another prospect is the leader that was chosen to the Ashkenazi Haredi party, Rabbi Isaac Goldknopf, who turns out to have a very low appeal for the more modern ultra-Orthodox in Israel, Haredi Modernim. They also are not appealed by his figure, by his statements, and there is some expectation for people from this group not to come out to vote.
All right, well, similarly, Lapid's Yesh Atid party is rising to a record size, according to the polls, but coalition partners Zava Galon and Merav Michaeli from Meretz and Labor, respectively, are saying that it's at their expense. Did Lapid just ensure his own defeat, Alex?
Well, if Lapid surges at the expense of Meretz and Labor and one or both of those parties fall below the threshold, then Yair Lapid will not be able to get to that critical number of 61. So ultimately, it doesn't matter so much for Lapid if he has 20 seats, but his bloc gets 62, or if he gets 30 seats and his bloc gets to 62. But if he gets to 30 seats and his bloc gets to 55, and then he can't form a government because one of those smaller parties he siphoned votes away from, it does make a very, very big difference.
So, I mean, should he have been campaigning really on their behalf, in a sense, to say, hey, these are my coalition partners. If you want to support me and the center left, support them?
Well, he has a conundrum because, several weeks back, he was polling much lower, around 20 seats. And the Likud at that time was polling even higher, around 32 seats. So you had almost a 10, 12 seat gap between the Likud and the Yesh Atid party. And if there was such a large gap, then it's very easy for the entire electorate to see that there's one clear ruling party, and then there's a bunch of smaller parties. In the last election, the Yesh Atid party got 17 seats, 13 seats below the Likud, and it was very clear that the Likud was the only very large potential ruling party. So he obviously wants to grow that number and try to shrink the gap. And actually, you've had the opposite phenomenon on the right side of the spectrum, where several votes from the Likud seem to be bleeding over to the party of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir on the right. So what you've actually had is a major shrinking of the gap between the Likud and Yesh Atid, and then Yair Lapid will hope to make an argument to President Bougie Herzog that there are two large potential ruling parties, and he will hope to get the first opportunity to form a government, provided that less than 61 members of the Knesset recommend Netanyahu as the prime minister.
All right.
I would add to that beyond the hair splitting and head counting of the seats, etc., there is also the general message that comes out from each of the blocks. The right wing, in my eyes, for the first time in many, many years, managed to come to these elections united. It depends how you define Ayelet Shaked, but it is fair to say that there is not a single party that is not going to cross the quite high threshold. And the messages that they deliver are those of unity, even though that there have been several disagreements in the past few weeks. pictures that was not taken with Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir together, embarrassing recordings of Bezalel Smotrich, I'd say smearing Netanyahu. All of these inconveniences went below the radar. It took very short amount of time for the bloc to reunite itself. And this is for itself a very strong message, because this means that if there will be a doubt as to whether Netanyahu or Lapid will be recommended, the right wing will come to this question after the election united with a single answer, Netanyahu, while the tensions between Lapid and the rear of his bloc, the Labour Party and Meretz, might cause an issue, might cause them to reflect whether or not to support Yesh Atid for this chair, and in this way to cause another election. This is probable to some extent.
Well, so now, Ziv, I want to stay on you for a moment. As long as we're talking about the possibility for sixth elections, there have been murmurings from within the Likud that they would actually try to oust Netanyahu if it came to a sixth election, especially because the previous 3-4 elections have been largely based on Bibi or not Bibi. Would you give any credence to that?
I'm inside the Likud. I'm a Likud member. I hear people. I do not hear those messages from within the Likud. This is the logic of someone who comes without and tries to think what would a Likud member think if he was to try to eliminate Netanyahu. The point is this: Netanyahu is considered beyond his what someone might conceive as failures in the past few elections, is far beyond the most gifted, talented statesman Israel had in many, many years. And this is what we expect of a prime minister. We have great men in the Likud, great women in the Likud, great candidates. None of them, as distinguished as they may be, comes near to Netanyahu's achievements in the issue of statesmanship. So regardless of what he manages to do in the political sense and his trial that he is in our eyes a political witch hunt against him, regardless of all of that, he is the only person in Israel in general and specifically in the right to be a legitimate candidate for becoming a prime minister. So this goes way beyond political small issues as to whether or not he managed to fund the government, because he is the only the right person in the right.
All right, Alex, final comment.
Well, I think that it's important to note that Netanyahu has not lost really any electoral support during these election cycles, despite the fact that the media doesn't want to be the prime minister, despite the fact that the prosecution saw fit to indict him and try him on several charges, which probably would not hold weight in American courts of law, and a bitter series of electoral campaigns basically centering around trying to get him out of office. So if Netanyahu wasn't able to secure 30 seats or more, then I think that you could have a good argument for why the Likud would want to replace him. But he still is able to garner that many seats. And the reason why he hasn't been the prime minister is because the parliament has actually colluded against him, and members of the right-wing bloc simply don't want to recognize the will of the voters and have actually defected from the right-wing bloc and gone to sit with the members of the minority left and with members of Arab parties, which really goes against the will of the electorate.
All right. We're going to have to end it there. But Ziv, Alex, thank you both so much for joining us again. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And of course, everybody watching at home, thank you for joining us. I'm Aaron Porras, and this was ILTV's Insider. Please tune in next time for more on everything Israel, and let us know in the comments online if there's a topic that you'd like us to cover next. And again, finally, for more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv and sign up for our streaming platform, ILTV Plus. We have a ton of new content there. Thank you again. Be well, and we'll see you soon.